Hello, I am Dan Alasso, and this is going to be another installment of what I guess is going to become a series of me talking about what I mean when I talk about markets and capitalism and business and that sort of thing. Because I think there's been a lot of confusion, and some of it has probably been deliberate and some of it's probably been accidental. But I think if we define our terms, we're going to be a lot better off. And so this is my contribution, I guess, to that conversation. And so, as I said, this is part 2 on capitalism. And so last time I concluded by defining capitalism. I said that when the excess that we earn is sitting in a vault or in someone's bank account, we call it wealth. And when a person uses that wealth to increase their ability to do or to make something else of value, we call that capital. And so a capitalist is someone who takes their excess, their wealth, their profits, and invests them into some value-producing enterprise. And then I said, well, that doesn't sound so bad, right? How could anybody be an anti-capitalist then? And I said that the answer is complicated, and it has a lot to do with the consequences of concentrations of wealth that tend to follow from these types of investments. And it also follows on the result of initial conditions that may not be equal, and also the shady types of things that people might do to win once this activity becomes a competitive venture. And that's probably going to take several installments. First thing that I think I ought to talk about before I get into all of those things is to drill down a little bit more. Concentrations of wealth. The idea of concentrating wealth has a lot to do with what we think of as property in the first place. What do property rights include? We often race by questions like this without even thinking about them. We all know what property is, right? Actually, it's a bit more complicated. To a great extent, property is a social construct. I know this is kind of tedious. This is like saying race is culturally constructed, which it is, but that's not the point here. The point is that other societies and other cultures have thought about property and about property rights in very different ways. You may have heard from American history that a major source of conflict between white colonists and native peoples was that, as they said, the Indians had no concept of private property. That's untrue. What they had was different ideas about what could be property and about the boundaries, really, between private and community. Western ideas of property have evolved gradually over time, influenced by a lot of things, like Napoleon's Code of Laws, British common law, and Enlightenment natural rights theories. But the biggest foundation, I think, for the West is probably Roman law. And these property ideas were developed in the idea of dominium during the Roman Empire, and they were later elaborated in the Middle Ages and finally expressed by an Italian jurist named Accursius, who lived from around 1182 to 1263, in the triad that we and our lawyers still use today: usus, fructus, and abusus. Usus means what it sounds like, the ability to use a thing. Helps to identify it as yours or mine. If I'm the one who uses this computer and I can tell other people whether or not they get to use it, then it's mine. Fructus comes from the Latin word for fruit, and it says that the owner controls the fruits of a thing, such as the apples from your tree, or the wool from your sheep, or the dividends from the bond you own. Initially, that also included the fruits of your labors, although that became complicated, especially if you were working as a tenant farmer, for example, on land somebody else owned, or, and especially after the Industrial Revolution, as an operator of a machine in a factory that was owned by somebody else. There are a lot of ways that a person can find themselves as an unfree laborer, and I'll talk about that in a bit. The final element of that legal triad, abusus, deals with the right of the owner to dispose of or even to destroy the thing that they own. In some cases, this seems to be no more than common sense. In order to get heat from a wood pile, of course, you have to burn it. In other cases, it seems less obvious. If an enslaved person was property, does that mean the slave owner has the right to dispose of that person? Or to sell them out of the family? Or even to kill them? Now, different cultures in world history have answered these questions differently. In the ancient world, people were aware that their fortunes might change, and they might find themselves or their families enslaved. When the Romans defeated Carthage in the final Punic War, or about 3 centuries later, Jerusalem in the final Jewish revolts, they killed most or all of the men, in both cases, and they sent the women and children into slavery. The Roman soldiers who did that and the slave owners who took control of those people were probably aware that had the fortunes of war been different, their wives and their children might have been the slaves. Another example, the Greek philosopher Diogenes the Cynic was captured by pirates during a journey, and he was sold into slavery. He took it philosophically and patiently tutored the children of his owner until his friends and students scraped together enough money to buy his freedom. And in Africa, before the advent of the Atlantic slave trade, people captured in tribal raids were typically enslaved. But they were also incorporated into the families of their owners, and their children were typically treated as full members of the community. All of these examples suggest that the ownership of humans is often considered to be less than that full triad. In the case of Africa, maybe it's only the first, usus, since the children were typically free members of the slave-owning society. Now, of course, this wasn't the case in the Atlantic slave trade, possibly because most white European slave owners saw their property as being completely different from themselves and couldn't even imagine finding themselves in a similar circumstance. Other types of property that were often not subject to abusus in many cultures were land and common natural resources. In many cases, prohibitions on destruction or even on the restriction of other people's access to commons had a spiritual or a religious element that prioritized stewardship or reciprocity with nature. Often there was also a communal interest in resources that were keys to the survival of the community. In the Americas, for example, Aztec floating gardens, the chinampas, were collectively managed, and alienating farmers from their garden plots required the emperor's approval. In Maya culture, city-states controlled the land and the commons like forests and water sources that couldn't be destroyed or sold. In the Inca Empire in South America, high-altitude terraced farms that had been painstakingly built over centuries by common effort were protected by harsh laws, even destroying the nesting grounds of cormorants, the seabirds whose guano was carried up into the hills and used to fertilize those Inca terraces was a capital crime. Currently, in today's economy, we don't think a lot about whether ownership rights ought to be absolute and ought to include all three of these elements. We may assume that usus, fructus, and abusus are all necessary in order for the modern economy to work and for people to become entrepreneurs and do business. That's not true. It's almost certain that you could accumulate capital in a usufruct system, which is one that allows people to use the things that they own, usus, and benefit from the fruits, fructus, but doesn't allow people to destroy them. Although the conventional wisdom, which you will see an example of if you ask an AI, although this conventional wisdom would say that economic growth would probably be slower in an economy that discouraged abusus, the reasoning and the examples that it used to support this are really not that compelling, in my opinion. It's certainly an area, at the very least, where I think more discussion would be beneficial. One final thing that we should consider about property is, how long does it last? Do we own a thing forever? For our lifetimes? For a set period of time that has something to do with what we're using it for? And do we get to pass it on to our heirs? Duration of ownership and heritability have also varied greatly with different cultures in different places and times. In cultures that focused on the centrality of families, like China and India, systems covering land and common goods often prioritized collective or lineage-based ownership and inheritance over absolute individual dominion. As an aside, it might be interesting to think about how ideas about property under Chinese communism might be related to these earlier systems. But in any case, land inheritance was often also tied to feudal obligations, while smaller items, which are called movables, were allowed to pass from owners to their heirs. One more final thing, and this really is the final thing this time. Businesses themselves were typically the property of the people who ran them. Before incorporation, businesses had no legal identities, but were extensions of personal and family property, like land or movables. In Roman law, which began with the 12 tables about 450 BCE, businesses like farms or workshops or fishing operations or trading houses could be passed to heirs who would be expected to continue the work. In medieval Europe, valuable guild memberships could be passed on, again provided the heir would continue the work. In China, merchant trades and other businesses like mining were family-based. Islamic law built on the mercantile nature of the families who built up the faith, so businesses and assets were heritable right from the start. In the pre-Columbian Americas, trades were often controlled by clans, so inheritance of a trade, and sometimes even of its tools, was more collective than individual. And in colonial America, inheritance of businesses and their assets could be designated in wills. Now we'll talk much more about how incorporation changed all that in a future installment. And we'll talk about those other things, concentration of wealth, initial conditions, and the shady stuff and the cheating as well. But I want to keep these somewhat bite-sized. So that's all for now. I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching, and I will see you again very soon.